What is ESG? ESG stands for Environmental, Social, and Corporate Governance. 大家都知道 ESG 现在非常的重要，但是它的未来以及如何影响公司的对外沟通又是什么呢？今天的单元我们就邀请到了 Seneca ESG 的 CEO Jonathan 来为大家解析实施 ESG 的痛点以及它的未来。Hello， 欢迎来到 Executive Plus 主管与沟通力的 Podcast。I'm Sherry, an educator, certified coach, and style enthusiast. 我相信专业有效的沟通是语言跟逻辑的完美结合。
And I'm Nick, a startup consultant, corporate trainer, and late-night gaming junkie. I believe great communication requires the right mindset and solid frameworks.
我们希望带给大家职场英语的技能、跨文化沟通技巧与其他能帮助您成为出色领导者的工具。
Join us each week as we share our experience, research, and methodologies to take your communication and language skills from good to great. Hey everybody, welcome back to the Executive Plus podcast. Today, we're bringing a special interview. Over the last month, Sherry and I have talked quite a bit about sustainability, greenwashing, or all the things that comes to when we talk about companies being sustainable. What phrases are they using? What ones are actually doing it? Well, today we have a special guest who can actually speak on this much more authority, talking about really what does it take for a company to truly think about sustainability. Andrew introduced us to Jonathan, who is running his own ESG consultancy, talking with these big companies around the world about what they can do to be more friendly to the environment and to themselves.
So I'll do a brief intro. I'll leave the real intro of Jonathan's backstory and also the story of Seneca ESG to the man himself. But suffice it to say, Jonathan, I think I thought your company at AppWorks Demo Day, actually. So through this accelerator program in Taiwan called AppWorks. And then we had a call and immediately, we've never actually met in person, right? But even then, I found your backstory as a multi-time entrepreneur, successful entrepreneur, now diving into the ESG space and not just being a consultant actually, but building a product that's helping companies digitize the way they track and report their ESG performances. But I'll come back to that keyword again. I would say an eloquent voice on ESG issues where I can ask you a lot of questions and you can explain them in a lot of clarity and being persuasive on this issue. That's the main reason why I wanted you to like come on the podcast. And thank you so much for kindly agreeing to. And with that, I want to ask you to introduce, maybe give us your background and also the origin and what Seneca ESG does.
Absolutely. And thank you so much for the opportunity to be on the podcast today. Appreciate it, Andrew, Sherry, and Nick. It's a pleasure and an honor to be with you today. And quick background on the company. Seneca ESG is a cloud software company focused on sustainability. And we're still pretty new. We're just over 2 years old and launched at the end of 2020. So this is really in the midst of COVID, actually, that we launched. And it was really to address a pretty burning need that we saw in the space, in the financial markets to begin with, I should say, which is that ESG is necessary. It's something that is on everyone's minds, yet it seems very difficult to understand. It can be quite complex in some ways. It could also be quite opaque, and it can also be ambiguous because ESG means different things to different people. And we wanted to bring clarity and transparency to that problem.
We also talked about your backstory that led you to this. Can you tell us a little bit about your background? Because this is not your first time founding a company.
Yeah, happy to. So this is my second startup. And the first one, I was fortunate enough to have had an exit from. And it's a company called Red Pulse, which I started in Shanghai in 2015. So about 8 years ago now. And we went through a couple of different iterations, a couple of different pivots, as people like to say. And what began as essentially a simple newsletter on China financial markets eventually evolved into a financial data platform. And then we eventually pivoted even into blockchain. So using a Web3, as people call it nowadays, approach to collecting, analyzing market insights, and doing so in a distributed, decentralized fashion that allows the authors to also benefit from the good works that they're contributing. And we were lucky enough to have launched that really at the growing tide of popularity and growth when it comes to blockchain projects and platforms. And then also had the fortune to be able to exit and sell that company and its IP and its assets to another company in early 2020. And the experience from that first startup was amazing, of course. So many ups and downs. I can't tell you how many times I thought we were just basically going to have to throw the towel in and close up shop. And that very much was on my mind, in a lot of cases. And when we managed to pivot towards the direction that actually did start to garner quite a bit of success, it really came as a surprise. And there were people that came up to me and said, wow, John, you really worked hard for this. We know what you went through. And there was literally a 10-month period of time where I was living on a couch in my office, which was essentially a one-bedroom apartment that we had converted into an office for 7 employees, myself included. And I wasn't paying myself a salary. I was living off of savings. I borrowed money from my parents, and I bought a 700 RMB couch off of Taobao. Found one of the cheapest ones on there. It folds down into a bed. I said, okay, that's the one. And that's what I slept on, for 10 months and ate Family Mart, meals every day. I just rode Mo bikes and Oppo bikes around town when I needed to get around. And it was actually a really pleasant time, but it was also a very simple time because it allowed me to really focus on the company. And I just put all of my time and energy into just that. And I was very fortunate to have had a really great kick-ass team around me. And I very much am forever indebted to that team that helped us to build that platform. And that then brings us to Seneca. So how did I segue from my first company, WebPulse, to Seneca? Well, I had a period of time of reflection. Started to do some soul searching. I wanted to find out what is it that I wanted to do next. And I had always been drawn to sustainability, and maybe not so much in those words or in that phrase per se, but it was from a very early age that I still remember my mom. I remember being in daycare, and I was probably 8 or 9 years old, and she helped to start this recycling program in the mid 80s at the daycare center, and that eventually expanded to the whole school, the elementary school that I was at the time. And it wasn't entirely unheard of at the time, this idea of recycling, but neither was it commonplace either. Okay, so I thought that was really cool. My mom took time out of her busy day, and growing up, my mom was working for Apple. Those were really intense days. Now I know, but back as a 8-year-old kid, I didn't really realize that my mom is probably working, 14-hour days, working on, the Macintosh project and things like that. That was really cool. But she took time out of her busy day to launch this recycling program, and that stuck with me. I thought that was really cool. And then the other element, the other catalyst that really drew me towards sustainability and also helped me align towards what my personal experiences were, what my career experiences were, was reading a book called Let My People Go Surfing, written by the founder of Patagonia named Yvon Chouinard. So he's obviously a very well-known person now, and people know him as this pioneer and also leader in the sustainability space. But what was fascinating about reading the book, Let My People Go Surfing, is that it chronicles not just his story, his journey of having started Patagonia really as a reluctant businessman, you could say, and eventually growing it to the behemoth that you see today. But it also shows you how he started that company with very strongly held principles of not wanting to do harm to the environment, not wanting to do harm to the community and to society at large, and to his employees and his customers and his partners. And that really was fascinating to me because it's not just about doing harm, but what could he do to actually proactively improve the status, the lives of others, and also the state of the environment around him. And those are a set of principles that he began with when he first started Patagonia and have continued to stick to throughout its growth. It showcases that you are able to you can stick to your principles, I should say, and also be successful at building a great business. They're not necessarily at odds with each other. It can be done, but it needs to be done with care and it needs to be done with an intention. And that's something that I think is possible for all companies. And it's one of the key reasons I got into ESG. My background is that I was in management consulting for over a decade, primarily for the financial services sector. So helping large banks, large asset managers to understand their market, create new strategies, product strategies, distribution strategies, customer strategies. And that is what I knew. And then I studied computer engineering undergrad before that. So it's this combination of engineering, computer, techie sort of background, as well as financial markets in terms of my applied experience, and really, well suited for fintech, so to speak. But when I saw that there was this angle where now many of these financial institutions, hedge funds, and mutual fund managers are now getting on board the ESG train, so to speak, that really piqued my interest. And I wanted to see how I could contribute to that space. And so, yeah, a bit long-winded, but that's sort of the meandering way that I finally arrived at me wanting to do something in ESG.
You talked about before that ESG is something that's a little bit opaque, or it has different meanings for different people or different companies. When building your platform, how do you keep that in mind, or what are you doing with your platform to either bring some more transparency to that or to help companies be a little bit more concrete when they're talking about ESG?
Right. This is one of the key questions, and I'm glad you asked it. So I think ESG by nature is a very subjective concept. And apart from the acronym itself, which of course everyone agrees what it actually stands for, environmental, social, and governance, there's not a whole lot else that people agree upon. And that's quite interesting, because you think of this concept, this almost monolithic concept that is on everyone's minds and is really a large part of conversations nowadays and when it comes to financial markets and investment and corporate management. Yet, how is it possible that we can't even get a handle on what ESG means? And that's fascinating. And it's also a reason, it's really the source of a lot of the confusion and challenges that we face today. When I mentioned earlier that ESG means different things to different people, I think therein lies the answer as well. We'll start first on the financial market side. You have financial institutions that are, for whatever reason, and there's several actually, we can get into that in a moment, but for several reasons, they want to better understand ESG. And they want to better understand the ESG performance or footprint, so to speak, of the companies that they invest in, the companies that they engage with, the companies that they help underwrite loans for or help issue equity offerings for. And generally speaking, they just need to get a better handle of what is the ESG performance of these companies. But the key challenge is that when they try to subscribe to a rating system, such as a well-known MSCI, Sustainalytics, S&P, Bloomberg, FTSE Russell, and there's many of them out there. I'm just naming a few of them. The pain point is that none of them align. It's almost as if they just completely in a vacuum created their own proprietary methodology for assessing for ESG and then pushed that out into the market. And that's problematic because financial institutions aren't used to that. Financial institutions are used to having a single truth when it comes to, well, is this company's credit good or bad? What's their credit rating, right? And you see Moody's, Fitch, and S&P. These are the three main credit ratings agencies globally. And to some surprise, they have come up with completely separate methodologies to measure the creditworthiness of a company, but there's 99% alignment. So somehow they've all created completely different parallel methodologies for measuring a company's creditworthiness, which is essentially its ability to service its own debt. I think that also is a reason for why they were able to achieve that alignment, is because the definition of creditworthiness is so succinct, it's so clear, right? It's in black and white, whereas the definition of ESG couldn't be less clear. Okay, and ESG can mean so many things to different people, and not only is there some debate, quite a lot of debate, as to what elements should be considered ESG and what elements should not. And I'll give you just one. Some of the listeners out there may be wondering, well, is there really a debate? It seems pretty straightforward to me. Well, one of those key elements that are continuing to be up for debate is the effect of externalities on a company's ability to continue operating, right? And so this is disaster recovery, this is business continuity planning, this is the impact from fire, flood, hurricane, earthquake, so on and so forth, systemic emergencies such as the banking system failing. And there's debate as to whether this should be considered ESG. And for some, it should. It's related to how the company interacts with the rest of the world and its impact, and also its impact on the company. But for others, the causality is in the wrong direction. They think of ESG and sustainability as something that a company does, and it extends outward, and it impacts the environment around them, it impacts people around them, it impacts the society around them. And so why should we consider those things that are external to that coming inwards as ESG? That's just something else altogether. So, things like that are still up for debate. And the other reason why ESG is so subjective is because people have different priorities in mind. Whereas one investor or capital owner, asset owner, may prioritize DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion. And another may prioritize carbon emissions reduction. And both are very important. And it would be very difficult to say conclusively which one is more important than the other, but you have to choose at some point if you're going to be creating a scoring methodology, right? And so who has made these decisions? It has by and large been those that create the rating systems, right? And so you would argue, well, why should it be them? And they would say, well, there's nobody else doing it. And that may have been true 10 years ago, but fast forward to today, there's no shortage of rating systems out there. And yet each and every one of these rating systems are still making these rather subjective decisions on behalf of their end users, which are essentially these financial institutions that rely upon them for these ratings, right? And so there is still validity to that, because there's still a huge proportion of financial institutions that are probably not yet even ready to make those decisions themselves. And they still need the hand-holding. They still need the help of these ratings institutions to give them what is sort of their view and their version of ESG assessment. But there's a growing tide of financial institutions that have become more sophisticated and are looking for something more robust, something that is more situation specific, as we call it. And so one of the first products that we developed at Seneca is called Zeno, Z-E-N-O for financial institutions. And what this does is it allows the end user, the analyst, to custom design their own ESG scorecard for different scenarios, different use cases. And if you consider that within a financial institution, you may have so many different situations to address. You may have different asset classes, you have different geographic focus, different sector focus, and perhaps even most critically, you have investors whose money that you're investing on behalf of. These asset owners also have their own views as to what's important to them when it comes to ESG. And so it just becomes much more apparent that you can't use a single scoring system that would then address all of those very different nuanced views and nuanced preferences. And so we've built a system that provides that flexibility. You can pick and choose which data to use from which databases, and we partner with all the major data vendors. And you can also set the weights to determine what is the priority. And you can determine essentially what is the score that should be attributed to each company according to these different nuances, these different characteristics that you're scoring for. So you could create a different scorecard for different investment strategies, different asset classes, different markets, and very importantly, for different LPs, limited partners. So these investors into these funds probably have different preferences as well. And that's how we've been able to tackle this problem of ESG meaning different things to different people. We're not trying to square the circle, so to speak. We're not trying to force any sort of worldview on anyone. It's really us observing and really reflecting on the fact that everyone's worldview is different, and that's okay. And we've created a toolkit that allows you to reflect that in how you score for ESG across your assets and across your portfolios.
I think you mentioned a financial institution, but I'm really curious as to, because, Nick and I have been looking at a lot of these 2C brands, and specifically these brands that sells, fast fashions, where they push consumerism. And of course, on their website, they wanted to talk about sustainability and what they have been doing to protect the environment. But a lot of times people see that as greenwashing. So I wanted to ask you, is there anything that these brands should consider when it comes to delivering that message of sustainability so that it's more clear to the consumer? Or how do they do that in order to avoid that greenwashing, that debate going on?
Yeah, that's a great question. Certainly greenwashing is a problem. It continues to be a problem to this day. But I'm also happy that it's still a direction towards wanting to do good. The incentive for doing so initially, I think, may not have been the best incentive. It's essentially to want to improve upon your reputation, your brand. There are several things that are being done to combat that from several different stakeholders. So I'm not worried about this. It's just a matter of time where eventually greenwashing will be entirely on its way out. So one of the key stakeholders is the disclosure setting bodies. So there are many, many different disclosure standards currently that corporates can choose from. And a few of the major ones include GRI, SASB, integrated reporting. And these are the three general ESG disclosure standards. And then you have climate-related ones such as TCFD and related to that GHG protocol. And then you have many, many, many sector-specific standards as well. And I think with the advent of these disclosure standards, it's bringing a lot more stringency to that process. It's more of a prescriptive process now than it was before. And what I mean by that is previously, and I get asked all the time, what's the difference between CSR and ESG? And while there is no entirely official definition and entirely official distinction between the two, the way that I distinguish between them is that CSR is sort of the 1.0 version of sustainability. And it stands for corporate social responsibility. So there's a very heavy element on the S for one thing. But the other element of that is there wasn't a lot of industry best practices as to how to characterize your CSR practices. And so without much guidance, companies were left to their own devices and ended up just sharing whatever they thought made them look good, right? And it's understandable. If you are putting time and effort into this, obviously you want to focus on those things that really paint your company in a good light, and you may not necessarily want to highlight those that put it in a bad light. And that, I think, is essentially, I think how greenwashing began. It probably was a bit more innocuous than some people, say it was. But what ESG is now today, it's also much more specific as to what they're asked to disclose. And so no longer is it possible for companies to just cherry pick all of these good stories and anecdotes of the good things that they've done and say, hey, this is our annual CSR report. If they were to do that today, it would be frowned upon, because now the global best practice is to use one or oftentimes several of these standards together to issue a much more transparent, much more structured, prescriptive ESG report in a way that even if there's some elements that your company may not be doing too well on, it's just necessary to report upon it, because that's what's asked for, in these disclosure standards. So disclosure standards is one way to combat greenwashing. The second way is through regulation. And so similarly to disclosure standards, there are now increasingly more stock exchanges that are requiring their listed companies to follow a certain set of guidelines for reporting upon their sustainability practices. So it's no longer, hey, tell us about, what good things you've done to help the environment or help the community. there's specific metrics that are being asked for. What is your total amount of kilowatt hours of electricity used and purchased? What is the total amount of miles driven or kilometers driven by your fleet cars? So it's now just much more specific to what's being asked for. And that helps to combat greenwashing. And then finally, I think there's been enough backlash from the market at large against greenwashing that now companies are really afraid of being labeled as a greenwasher. Even if they don't do so, they certainly didn't plan to do so. And now there's this fear, that they might be labeled as such. So I think companies are just extra careful now to try not to be labeled as such.
I mean, a major theme that I've kind of gotten from all the different pieces of what you talked about with ESG is just the amount of complexity, both on the outside, as far as the regulatory, the guidelines, how are we quantifying and defining ESG, but then even internally within your company, setting those and giving people the tools to bring all this complexity and then build it the way that they want to. So kind of a two-part question around that. One is, how have you thought about taking this complexity or very difficult problems with a lot of moving parts and then bringing them something in that a company can just again, they can move a few levers, figure out how they want to define it. What's the thought process behind that? And then two, because this is such a complex space and like you said, it's a bit opaque, there's a lot of chaos. Has there been a moment in the life of your company where you just felt like, wow, we've really found a way, whether it's like a customer said, this makes it so much simpler, or a customer just came and felt they had clarity, where you're just like, okay, we figured out something. We really struck a chord in taking the chaos and bringing it into something that people are like, I can do that. I can get on board with this.
So I'll answer the first part of your question first. And that's the thinking process that went into simplifying these complex things. Yeah, absolutely. That's one of the things that actually excites me every day, because it makes me feel happy and fulfilled that, number one, I'm now working in a space that I think is doing good for the world, and that makes me feel good. But the other part of it is I get to use all the things that I've learned and the things that I've experienced as a consultant, back in those days, and as a student in computer engineering back in those days. It's coming full circle. Sure, I've learned computer programming. I've been in financial markets for a while, and ESG is a new thing. But if you see how it's being applied, it follows some of the same themes as other things in the past. And the one that I would bring up is financial accounting. Something very dry and boring in some people's eyes. But what's interesting is that it is now a no-brainer to think about using accounting software. Whereas if you rewind a couple decades when accounting standards are first coming together, and every country had its own standard, right? And that was chaos. And eventually we arrived at one standard, IFRS. Well, really two. The US is still using their own US GAAP. But by and large, we have most of the world using a single standard now. And now people don't give it a second thought. It doesn't matter if you're a 2-person company or a 20,000 person company, you're using accounting software. No one's going to be using Excel or God forbid, a pen and paper to do their books. No one's doing that anymore. Okay. If you got a 2-person company, you're using QuickBooks, or you're using FreshBooks, you're using Xero, because it's just much easier. The numbers fall into place. You follow the same rules. The system spits out a format that is regulatory compliant. And I tend to think of ESG as something similar, where we will follow that similar path. Where right now it's all over the place, and there's no single standard. People are still trying to figure out what ESG is even. But we'll get to a point where there's enough education and enough standardization where software will become commonplace. And that's what Seneca ESG is banking on. We're planning for that future, and we're building the product, and we're securing the clients today, so that we'll have a good presence and a good positioning once that eventuality comes. And so the second part of your question is, I think the chaotic nature is related to what I just mentioned. Actually, it's the chaotic nature and it is something that I think Seneca ESG is playing a important role in. There may be others that are also doing the same, maybe something similar, but probably not exactly in the way that we're doing it. How we're bringing simplicity to chaos is through technology. It's through the software solution that we've built. It's also now we're starting to explore using AI to streamline how to integrate across so many different disclosure frameworks on the corporate side, and also how to create more manageable ways to create custom scorecards that fit different scenarios and try to bring order to chaos, but still recognizing that ESG is a very subjective, nuanced concept. And to try to fit a single rigid system to that is not a feasible solution. So it's a balance you have to strike between providing tools that allow you to streamline, simplify, and automate, but not getting it too watered down to the point where you don't have transparency and control over the whole process. And that's sort of the needle that we're threading there with our solutions.
With that, I needed to ask, what do you think is the kind of the next big thing for ESG? I know you mentioned AI and how that's going to help with bringing that chaos into order, but is there anything else that you're seeing?
Yeah, I think integration is going to be important. And we have some larger clients that already, of course, use other ERP systems such as SAP, Microsoft, Oracle. And there's a lot of data that's already embedded in those systems. And in order for us to streamline to the maximum degree possible the overall ESG workflows, we continue to build integrations with these systems. We just want to minimize the amount of human intervention and potential for error and rework as much as possible. And that's going to be a big part. The other big part is the way in which data is being shared, ESG data. And right now, it's being shared in a really interesting, very odd way, I would say, because it's being shared in the form of these written 200 to 300 page reports, these glossy PDF reports. And yeah, it's laughable actually how this is being done, because that's just the way that it's always been done. And well, it's only been done for the last 10 years or so, but 10 years is enough time to set a precedent. And now everyone just has it in their heads that, well, we need a report annually in this nice glossy PDF, and we're not going to print it. We want to save the environment, but it's still going to be this super long PDF. And what's really fascinating is that who actually reads through the entirety of the report as if their job depended upon it, and it does, are those analysts that are trying to pick out the data from this report, right? And a lot of this data is quantitative in nature, or it's yes, no, or it's percentages, ratios, what have you. And they're having to pick this out from essentially an unstructured form, which is, human written report form. When you really think about it, the data that they're trying to extract, it began as structured data, right? Because it had to have been collected by somebody or some group of people within these corporates and then put into some structured format, probably a CSV file or some Excel file at some point, aggregated, and then handed to the report writing department, or maybe it's a third-party consultant that then transforms that from structured data to an unstructured form. And then that's what they share with everyone. And so it's really odd because you go from structured data to unstructured, and then it goes out externally, and then analysts pick it up and have to retransform it into structured data. It just seems like a whole lot of extra work for everyone involved. It doesn't make a whole lot of sense. So I think the direction that we're moving already actually is to still have that nice glossy report, with the chairman's message at the front, his photo and signature, and photos of the trees that you planted and the volunteer hours that you've done in the community. I mean, that's great. People love seeing that. I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. It helps to give that human element to the narrative, the sustainability story for the company. But at the same time, what's becoming hopefully an industry standard is the usage of XBRL, which is a structured data format that allows corporates to report upon their information in a way that analysts can just directly use, right? And what's also quite interesting to see, and it's also a key trend I wanted to make mention of, is the gradual transition from calling this sort of data disclosure, ESG disclosure, to non-financial reporting. So it's a much more broad term, and I think it's much more applicable because we can't just keep adding acronyms or adding letters to the acronym, right? ESG, because that's what we've been doing. We've been adding corporate governance, we've been adding health and safety and environmental issues. Just going to end up with like a 15-letter long acronym for all the things that we want to capture. But really, when it comes down to it, we're just really capturing now all the things that are outside of the financial realm of a company's operations. And the financial bit of it, that's already been well covered. That's IFRS, that's US GAAP, right? And there's a very well defined set of workflows and regulatory requirements for how you manage that process and you report upon your financial data. And now all these things that we're now capturing for outside of that, I think is actually much better termed as non-financial reporting. And that's the direction that we're going. And eventually we will see a consolidation of financial reporting and non-financial reporting to just be called corporate reporting. And that's actually going to be very important for the industry because now there's going to be a much more complete picture of a company's operations. And no longer will you really feel the need to separate out the financial versus non-financial. Both sides are intended to tell a more clear picture of the company and its operations and its future prospects for growth and success. And so that's where I think we're going.
I wanted to ask you about the most memorable time when you had to talk about these issues and also present Seneca to a corporation, because I know your clients come from all kinds of places. Like you have clients in Taiwan and Australia and Africa and Europe and North America. But what was the most memorable time when you were talking, like a story of talking to a client about these issues?
Yeah, I think one of the most memorable anecdotes that I can share it was very early on in the company's existence, and probably just a few months in actually. And we just created an MVP of the Zeno product for financial institutions. And I was speaking to a large Canadian pension fund, and I went through a brief demo and explained to them what it did. And at the end of the demo, I got a completely surprising response. Oh, that looks really interesting. And I really wish you had reached out to us 18 months ago because we probably would sign on and be a client and be a very happy client. But the fact of the matter is we have built something similar internally, and it's almost kind of surprising how similar your approach is to ours, but we've already expended resources, we've invested, and it may not actually be as sophisticated as what you just showed me actually, but we have something similar to it already. So yeah, sorry about that. It just, timing, I guess. And so it was, you could say it's a negative because we didn't get the deal, but for me, that was a huge positive because it gave me the confidence to continue, because I had just gotten so used to financial institutions saying, "What, this is really sophisticated. It looks really interesting, but we don't really need this. Why? I mean, we just use these rating systems. That works pretty well, and why do we need to build this or have you build it for us?" So that was that first indication of actual demand, even though they didn't actually demand it themselves, but that was inspirational to me, and gave me confidence to continue.
Right. It's like when you had your first company and then these ESG, like how did you seize that timing? Because a lot of people see timing as luck, but you had to know how to seize that timing well.
Yeah, I 100% agree. A lot of it has to do with luck. And I certainly don't claim that Seneca ESG has timed it correctly. The only thing that we can hope for is that we are early rather than late, because early we can deal with. Okay, as long as you stay alive long enough, whether it's through fundraising or revenue, then you'll be fine. If you've got a product that is eventually going to be in demand, then you'll be okay. And
you just eat at Family Mart and survive, and sleep on the couch and then make it, right?
It's easier said than done. I sound a bit flippant, saying just stay alive. That can be one of the most difficult things to do as an entrepreneur, is just to stay alive. But as long as you're early, hopefully not too early, otherwise, you're eating Family Mart meals for too long, then, you have a shot at it. I shouldn't say you'll be okay. You'll have a shot at it. But if you're too late, then yeah, that's the game's over. So I feel confident that, at the very least, we were a bit early in coming to market with our product.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for your time. If people want to learn more about yourself or more about Seneca, where can they go to get more information?
They can come to www.senecaesg.com, and that's spelled SENECAESG.com.
And we'll have the link down below in our show notes.
Well, thank you so much for your time. We really appreciate it. I think we learned a lot more about what's going on in this world than, the brief overviews you get in articles or, like you said, the non-definitions of ESG, but really bringing that into what's happening, where's it going, and hopefully how people can get started with this. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Jonathan. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
No worries, guys. Thanks for the opportunity.
The Executive Plus podcast is a Presentality Group production, produced and hosted by Sherry Fang and Nick Howard. You can search us on Facebook, 主管英文 Executive Plus. You can also find us on Instagram, Communication R&D, and email us at sherry@epstyleplus.com.